Hi, class. Picking back up on topic one here, following the end of the Civil War is what we're going to look at today. So, the two generals that were the head of both armies, remember the South had a much superior general leading the army, and General Robert E. Lee. He was very skilled. He was number one in his class at West Point. In the Mexican-American War, he was one of the generals that received a great deal of respect. And honestly, the North thought that they were going to get Robert E. Lee because he was opposed to slavery. However, he was from Virginia, and he felt like his state pride outweighed his distaste for slavery. Also, on a side note, Arlington National Cemetery is currently built on the property of Robert E. Lee after it was confiscated during the Civil War. You can still visit the house today. Now, General Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, later becomes president of the United States after Andrew Johnson. He is one of a series of generals that takes control of the northern armies that Abraham Lincoln was getting very frustrated with prior generals that weren't being very aggressive. They were being passive, even though they had the numbers and the supplies to help win the war. Ulysses S. Grant was willing to be more aggressive and willing to go after Robert E. Lee. So not as skilled, but he was willing to be aggressive. So finally, fast forward, you're going to study several key battles. But the last is the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, which is actually a town. At Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia on April 9th, 1865, General Lee sits down with General Grant and signs an agreement to surrender the Army of Virginia to him, which ultimately ends the Civil War and forces the South to surrender to the North. While the South fought bravely throughout the war, and have fought valiantly and won many battles they probably should not have won because of their better training, the North had far superior men, far superior numbers of men, and far superior supplies and food. The longer this war lasted, the lower the odds were that the South was going to be able to win. And because it lasted over 4 years, the North was able to successfully defeat the South. So what were the final costs of the Civil War? The North spent $3.4 billion and had almost 1 million men die, with another 364,000 wounded. This is an incredibly large expense during this time period. You would be talking about hundreds of billions of dollars today. Meanwhile, the South, who did not have nearly as much money, as much wealth as the North, spent $3.3 billion, where they had to borrow large sums of it. And guess who got to accumulate that debt once the war was over? All of the states had to pay those debts of the South that they accumulated during the war. That was an agreement that the North had to bring them back into the Union. They also had 683,000 people die and 260,000 wounded. I always like to mention the wounded because a lot of those men had to go back and find work. You're talking about over 600,000 men that were maimed, arms chopped off, legs chopped off, etc., that had to go and try and fit back in to the world's economy, and it was very difficult for a lot of them. One of the key aspects after the Civil War was over was the passage of the 13th Amendment, which was very contentious and difficult to pass through Congress and the states. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery anywhere in the United States, so it took the Emancipation Proclamation a few steps further. The exact wording is, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, now catch this key, except as a punishment for crime, wherever the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to its jurisdiction. What that means is if you're convicted of a crime and you go to prison, you can still be forced to do manual labor without pay. But that's the only circumstance you're allowed to do that in the United States today. So the war is over. And it's not like the Revolutionary War, where we all celebrate. Woohoo, America, we declared our independence. Not so much. We have a long road ahead of us. Sherman's March to the Sea destroyed the Southern economy. Battles throughout the South had ruined Southern culture. America was divided, and 4 million slaves just got their freedom, but they don't have a penny to their name. They don't own any land. They have nowhere to go. How are we going to make this work? It's not going to be easy. In fact, it's going to divide the country very, very much. One activity we'll do in class is I'll ask, if you were president of the United States, how would you treat these states that seceded and fought against you for their own independence because they hated you so much? How do you welcome someone like that back into your country? All right. what would you do to help rebuild the Southern economy? You're kind of responsible for destroying it. But is it the Northern people's responsibility to pay taxes to help the South, who seceded because they hated the North? If I'm a Northern citizen, I don't want to pay for that. That's not fair to me. I didn't ask them to secede. They chose to do it. So there's a lot of contentiousness over who pays for the rebuilding of the South, even though everybody agrees we have to rebuild it. How would the slaves incorporate into a new everyday society? These people have never worked for money before. Are they going to go back and work for the former plantation owners and get paid to work the farms? Unfortunately, that's what a lot of them do, because what other skills do they have? Many of them can't read. Many of them don't have other skills. So they're forced to go back and work for a lot of the slave owners. So because it was such a big plan to try and reconstruct the country, 3 plans arise. First is President Lincoln's. And unfortunately, President Lincoln's doesn't last very long because, well, President Lincoln dies, right? He gets shot. But his plan was actually very, very weak comparatively to some of the other plans. The first thing he asked was he required 10% states voters so they could take an oath of loyalty to the Union to rejoin the Union. Now, you might be thinking, only 10%? That's not very high. That was intentional. He didn't want to force these people to come back under his rule. He wanted an oath of loyalty to prove that there were people that wanted to come back. And he also secretly thought that many, many more than 10% would sign off on the oath of loyalty. Then he required states to accept the emancipation of slaves. They had to let go of their slaves as a part of agreement to end the war. And he offered full pardons to all former Confederates, extraordinarily generous, that many of the Republicans in Congress disagreed with him on. When Lincoln was killed, President Andrew Johnson comes into office, and we'll talk about him quite a bit in this class. He is a Republican from Tennessee, so he was not a Northerner. He was sympathetic to slavery and Southern slave owners. He was also a horrible alcoholic who is notorious for, during his victory speech in 1864, being very intoxicated, slurring his words, and stumbling up to the podium. Now, this man's our president, so he already has lost a lot of respect in the country because of his actions. He wanted to require former Confederates with property worth $20,000 or more to obtain presidential pardons in order to vote or hold office, a very significant request of the president. He would give full pardons to other Confederates with less land. That meant that the plantation owners, the wealth of the South, had to specifically go to the president and promise that they would follow the laws of the land that were created after the Civil War. He also was going to require ratification of the 13th Amendment, essentially the same thing that Lincoln did by accepting emancipation of the slaves. The radical Republicans were called radical for a reason. These were the Republicans in Congress with the most abstract views of how we should let these people back in to the United States. They wanted to require 50% of a state to take an oath of loyalty, which a lot of people thought was very reasonable. In fact, some thought it should be 100%. Let's force them to all agree to come back into the Union, or they don't get to come. So they also wanted each state to call a new constitutional convention and write a new government banning slavery in their state governments. The divided South into 5 military districts that would still be occupied by the Union soldiers after the war to ensure that the South didn't just reorganize and try to continue the fight after we left. They wanted to require state legislatures to adopt new constitutions guaranteeing African Americans' right to vote. That's what suffrage is. So not only did they want them to free the slaves, they wanted to guarantee them in their new state governments the right to vote in the state. Lastly, it required them to accept the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is a little more unique here. It requires citizenship of all new freely slaves, and it also required equality under the law. So laws that were made to discriminate could not exist anymore against African Americans. That's it for this lesson. Tune in next time.